So hello, welcome to my video introducing my series for Introduction to Human Anatomy. So I want to make several videos, about the foundations of human anatomy. And in this video, we will start with the circulatory system. And this is talking about the heart, basically. Now, I've highlighted some topics here that we will cover in this presentation, which basically include diseases related to the heart. So things like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, for example, HCM, which we'll cover later in this video. Supplying of oxygen and nutrients throughout through the red blood cells, through to the target cells, target tissues that need those cells, so that need that oxygen to keep functioning, to do their functions. Your heart structure, so talking about the four chambers of the heart, your atria, your ventricles, as well as talking about your valves as well to block certain areas of the body. So that they close to allow to the pumping of blood throughout the heart. We'll talk about more on that later. How the heart pumps blood. So we'll talk about the atrioventricular nodes, AVNs, SANs as well, sinoatrial nodes, and we'll talk about more on that throughout the video, and also, maintaining the heart health. So how can we prevent these heart diseases? How can we maintain a good heart health? So we'll talk about everything in here. Now, I want to firstly highlight some statistics first before heading into, why this is important, why it's important to highlight these issues and understand these basics of circulatory system. So firstly, according to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the heart disease is the leading cause of death for both males and females. Actually, in 2023, there was about 1 in every 3 deaths which happened that were cardiovascular disease related in the USA alone. So there was about 919,032 deaths which happened, which is a large figure. According to the Million Hearts, the number of strokes and heart attacks is approximately 1.5 million per year in the USA. The Heart Foundation states that heart attacks are responsible for almost 1 in 25 of all deaths globally. And this accounts for 4% of the deaths. And the New York State Department of Health highlights that 35% of heart disease mortality is due to physical inactivity. Now, looking at the diagram, there are 4 chambers of the heart. So the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle, and the left ventricle. Now, what's the role? So basically, the left atrium receives oxygenated blood coming from the lungs via the pulmonary veins. And then this blood is basically transferred to the left ventricle. Now, their respective pair has a different role. So the right atrium, so the right side of the heart we're talking about. From our perspective, it's the left side of the heart. Basically receives the oxygenated blood coming from the inferior and superior vena cava. So that's the you can see on the left side, there's a superior vena cava, top and bottom. Basically, the blood from the atria is again transferred to the right ventricle, which then in turn pumps the oxygenated blood to the lungs through pulmonary arteries. Furthermore, there are valves. The specific valves we have here are basically the atrioventricular valves, or AV valves, which are specifically the right and left AV valves. The semilunar valves, specifically the pulmonary and aortic valves. And now the valves basically act like gates, which basically control the flow of blood by opening or closing themselves. The sinoatrial node, which is SAN, and the atrioventricular node, AVN, the bundle of His, and the Purkinje fibers. But this is a separate topic which I'll cover in the next couple of slides, basically. So now you might ask, when do the ventricles close? Well, during ventricular diastole, where the ventricles are relaxed to let the chamber fill up with blood, they close to prevent backflow of blood coming from the aorta, or basically the pulmonary arteries, both of these blood vessels on the top. Also, they might close during a certain process called isovolumetric contraction, which is basically where during ventricular systole, which is basically where the ventricles contract to pump blood out of the heart, the ventricles begin to contract in this ventricular systole. So the heart valves are basically closed then as well. Now, during isovolumetric relaxation, instead, After isovolumetric contraction, there is a period for relaxation for the ventricles just before contracting again for the next cycle, which is then where it will be repeated. Now, during this period, valves are also closed, and this can also be opened during ventricular diastole to fill with blood, and also at the start of the ventricular systole. We got, the apex of the heart, which is like the bottom tip of the heart, and basically we also got the septum in here. Basically where the contraction of the ventricle starts, the apex. So this moves upwards and then pushes the blood out. It basically has the electrical functions like coordinating contractions, things like that. It basically helps the heart pump blood. So now we got the structures before explanation. So I want to firstly highlight these structures I mentioned before in my explanation, and the sinoatrial nodes, the atrioventricular nodes, bundle of His, and Purkinje fibers. Now we begin with the sinoatrial nodes. So now the sinoatrial nodes, or SAN, generates electrical impulses, which are called action potentials. So you might know from previous university lectures, but they're called action potentials, and this causes the atria to contract, and this leads to blood being forced into the ventricles, which this leads to blood being forced into the ventricles. Now this impulse reaches the AVN, the atrioventricular node, which then introduces a delay, which allows the time for the ventricles to fill with blood from the atria before they have to contract. So they allow, they're relaxed, fill up with blood, and then they, contract to pump the blood out. But that delay allows that to fill with blood to do that. After this delay, the impulse moves from the AVN into the bundle of His in the septum, which then helps to direct this impulse into both lower ventricles. And then this reaches the Purkinje fibers, which are kind of like branched out throughout the walls of both ventricles at the bottom, basically. These electrical impulses, or action potentials, cause the ventricles to contract from the apex of the heart, in other words, from the tip I mentioned before, to the base, which is like located at the top part of the heart, where the major blood vessels connect. Now, this causes the pumping of the blood out of the heart, which hence causes that pumping out. And now we got basically the explanation. So now we got the role. I'm going to say, wait, I forgot to. Okay, now we begin with the sinoatrial node, or SAN, generating electrical impulses, which we call action potentials. And this causes the atria to contract, the top chambers, basically. So this leads to blood being forced into the ventricles. This impulse reaches the AVN, which then introduces a delay, which allows time for the ventricles to fill with blood from the atria before they have to contract. So basically, they just it's like they relax in order to allow themselves to fill with blood, so that they can carry the function of pumping blood out to different parts of the body or through the lungs. After this delay, the impulse moves basically from the atrioventricular node, or AVN, into the bundle of His in the septum, which is, as I mentioned before, is just like the wall in the middle, which separates oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. And this helps to direct this impulse into both lower ventricles. Now, basically what it does is that it carries these action potentials down into both lower ventricles, which they will reach the Purkinje fibers. They're kind of like a transport system, basically. And now these Purkinje fibers, they're kind of like branched out throughout the walls of both ventricles, in the lower walls of them. These electrical impulses cause the ventricles to contract from the apex of the heart, the tip of the heart at the bottom, to the base, which is like located at the top of the heart, where the major blood vessels connect. And this causes the pumping of the blood out of the heart. Now we got the role of the red blood cells, which is basically to transport oxygen and nutrients around the body to target cells. So they basically, these cells need these nutrients and oxygen, and the red blood cells will carry some of these nutrients, and they will carry this oxygen needed for these cells to do their functions. They are also in charge of removing waste, for example, carbon dioxide out of the body. The red blood cells contains, this structure called hemoglobin. This is a protein that binds to oxygen to produce oxyhemoglobin. Now, the hemoglobin has basically a high affinity for oxygen during conditions where there's a ton of oxygen available. And you might guess, where's that? Where are those locations where there's a lot of oxygen? It's in the lungs. You breathe in air that basically has a lot of oxygen, and that's basically where the conditions of high oxygen conditions are available. And this means that the hemoglobin will readily pick up this oxygen from the lungs, and hence the oxygen picked up will bind to the hemoglobin and convert this oxyhemoglobin I mentioned before, which once loaded, the red blood cells will travel through the bloodstream and deliver the oxygen into the target cells or organs. Now, reaching those cells or organs that require the oxygen, the red blood cells will enter conditions of low oxygen availability. As the target cells, continuously use this oxygen, hence they have low oxygen conditions, which affects the affinity for oxygen for this hemoglobin. Now, because the hemoglobin reaches those conditions of low oxygen, causes them to have a low affinity for that oxygen. Hence, this will release this will cause the release of oxygen into those cells, allowing them to supply with oxygen. Furthermore, to note, in these cells where there's a lot of carbon dioxide, there's also increased lactic acid, and there's also other metabolic byproducts which can also promote the oxygen release from hemoglobin. So it's basically all biologically engineered to carry out the function. As mentioned, they also have roles of transporting important nutrients like amino acids and glucose, and then this will basically return to the lungs, pick up the carbon dioxide firstly from the tissues, and then head to the lungs, and then the carbon dioxide will be released, and then new oxygen will be taken in through the alveoli, and then we repeat the cycle of supplying oxygen to these target cells, and removing the waste that they have. Now, as I hinted at the beginning of the presentation with all of my statistics, heart disease is one of the leading causes of death in a global scale, which basically accounts for a significant number annually. So I want to highlight some common heart diseases that people have fallen victim to. So we firstly have heart failure, which is also known as the congestive heart failure. And this is basically a cardiac disease where the heart muscle doesn't pump sufficient blood as it should. And this basically, as you might guess, builds up fluid in the lungs, which can result in shortness of breath. So you might see people struggling to breathe. That might be a sign of congestive heart failure. But you might be asking, how can this be caused? Well, basically, some other diseases can cause heart to weaken or become stiff, to fill with blood and pump them around the body properly. And some things you might want to do, which include basically trying to lose weight, trying to lower your daily calorie intake, as well as exercising as well. Just doing a bit of cardio, going to the gym, eating less salt in your diet, and managing stress levels. And this disease can actually be treated using heart transplant or even a device which basically helps with the pumping of blood. We also got hypertension here, which is basically a common disease which occurs when you have a high blood pressure in your blood vessels. This condition can increase the risk of serious heart health, which basically can include things like your kidney problems or even stroke. And basically there's two types of your hypertension, which is stage 1 and stage 2. Now, stage 1 hypertension occurs when the systolic, which is the top part of your blood pressure, is between 130 to 139 millimeters of mercury, or mmHg, or the diastolic, which is the bottom part, the bottom number, that you find in these blood pressure machines, should be between 80 to 89 millimeters of mercury for them to have hypertension. Now, we got stage 2, which is has different values from stage 1. Now, the systolic, the top number is 140 millimeters of mercury or higher, or a diastolic of 90 millimeters of mercury or higher. So these are basically actually causes and risk factors, which basically includes age, unhealthy lifestyles, like taking a high salt diet, being obese. Things like stress and smoking also contributes to having hypertension. So we should avoid doing all of that altogether. No, however, this can actually be treated, making some changes in your lifestyle, as I mentioned, including changes in your diet, more physical exercise as well, medications if needed, and also regular monitoring of your blood pressure. So you can buy one of those like blood pressure machines on Amazon for not too expensive, but helps you check your blood pressure at home. And finally, I want to highlight hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or HCM. So now this basically occurs when the heart's muscle of the left ventricle is too thick, and this can pose an obstacle to the blood flow. And this affects the heart's ability to relax and fill properly with blood, which causes symptoms like fatigue, chest pain, palpitations, and even shortness of breath. And this disease is caused by mutations in your genes, which are, that code for proteins used in your heart muscle. And despite these complications, it can actually be managed or even treated through things like medications, beta blockers or antiarrhythmic medications. There's also like some surgical treatments, which are, for example, like your septal myectomy. And this is basically just like the removal of a portion of your thickened wall between both ventricles. And finally, doctors can also implant a device that is a defibrillator and that can prevent sudden cardiac death as well. Okay, so now, thank you for watching this video on some foundations of the circular system. So there's a ton of websites out there, even ChatGPT, to explore the topic more concisely with further detail. So it's a fascinating subject, so please do take some time to do your own research. Thank you for watching.